Welcome to Roke's Legal AI Conversations, where I'm having grounded discussions about AI in law with legal professionals. I'm joined today by Jason Marett, a former AM Law 100 attorney who helped lead one of the first Big Law's AI incubators. He's worked across litigation, finance, and ethics, and is currently focused on how lawyers can adopt AI responsibly while managing the risks. Without further ado, let's jump straight into our conversation. So, hey, Jason, really glad we're doing this. So, you've seen how Big Law goes about AI from the inside. And then, on the other hand, I work with smaller firms and in house teams on making the adoption safe and practical. And I think that this mix gives us a chance to look at both ends of the spectrum. So, but before we dive in, can you just give everyone listening a quick snapshot of your background and journey?
Sure. Well, I took an untraditional intro to law. I started off as a musical theater major, as you can tell by my background, and started working for a law firm then my senior year of undergrad. Mid-sized firm, litigation, but I've seen everything from law clerk to legal assistant, then moving into big law, into mass tort and environmental litigation, where we used a lot of e-discovery and legal technology there, then moving in-house conflicts and ethics work before moving back into practice in leverage finance, where I helped lead one of the first AI incubators in big law, which was very fulfilling and interesting. But that was 6, 7 years ago now. And so now seeing that we're still dealing with the same problems of implementation, despite the fact that there's obvious cost benefits, and then those cost benefits not necessarily being passed on to the clients. So that's kind of the focus of my current research. I wanted to step back out of law so I could look at AI in a more holistic way, to look at all the different kinds of risks that clients may face, whether they're environmental, bias, confidentiality, just to get a bigger picture.
And you're focused on the risk side of the things and yeah, how to mitigate that.
Right, because I think that I already have a pretty good idea of how it can be used in practice. So it was more
Mhm.
focused on why it wasn't being as widely adopted. And to
Mhm.
do that, I think you have to look at the different kinds of risks associated, whether it's the privacy of the data that's being stored on these third-party servers, or if it's just, as we've seen with all the hallucination headlines, just a failure to verify your outputs on numerous occasions. But we can get into that later. So yeah, it was all very interesting to me, but it was almost overwhelming to do that and practice at the same time. So I wanted to pursue a potential dissertation where I may partner with my old law school, their ethics department, their legal technology lab, but eventually came to the realization that everything is moving so fast that by the time I finished my dissertation that it may be irrelevant. So yeah, no, just really meeting a lot of different kinds of people working in the space, but in very different components, whether it's benchmarking, implementation, the privacy, cybersecurity risks. So yeah, it's going to be a fun next few years for
Yeah,
lawyers.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, especially since we're still kind of in the hype cycle and we're trying to, we're waiting for this to become linear again and a little bit more
Right.
sane. But can you tell me a little bit more about what was your experience with leading the incubators? Yeah, before even this generative AI boom happened. Um, because I know that you mentioned e-discovery. In e-discovery, machine learning was widely used for years
Right.
before Gen AI.
Right. So we've had these basic clause extraction tools where you could identify various deal components in securitization. So it seemed like a really good use case to be able to take the data room, put it into an AI solution. So interviewing, testing different vendors, ultimately deciding on one that I ended up going to work for right before COVID to
Interesting.
actually address this issue of how to better not well, I guess sell the technology to law firms, because you have the initial sell phase, you show the capabilities, you may test one or two use cases, but then it seems like it's very much dependent on the people at the firm that are passionate about doing it. And it's one of those things, if it's not maintained, that it's very easily seen as not a value add,
Mhm.
and you just revert to the old way of working because it does take that extra layer. But with that extra layer, you have the opportunity to capture so many more interesting data points for your client, not only for use in that particular case. So, a securitization, if they have a question, what's the overall governing law? 6 years ago, we were able to do that. So, now adding this AI layer on top of it is really exciting, but it's also highlighting a lot of issues within the legal profession about speed, accuracy, double checking your work. And now that we have tools that are being sold as sometimes a one stop shop, these are the capabilities, it can do XYZ, that it's then interpreted that it's applicable to various different use cases, which it hasn't been tested, and you haven't implemented the various policies, procedures, human in the loop checkpoints necessary for that particular practice group. So something that worked well for the securitization practice group may not have much benefit for bankruptcy, or it may, or
Mhm.
estates group. So really understanding the way that your practice groups work, but also being able to take the time to map your different flows, different use cases, to be able to then analyze, okay, this is where our time is being drained. This is a potential use case for AI. Then approaching that from different angles. And in law firm implementation, it's very quick because the use cases tend to be tied to a deliverable.
Mhm.
So taking the chance of then implementing that workflow, that process in a live deal, it becomes, an unknown risk. And so now I think we're getting to the point where it's becoming more common use. We have more use cases. So yeah.
Very interesting. And then how did the, because I guess that with, I'm going to call it traditional AI, so the machine learning models that were used, with those we also saw some risks. And with those especially, they don't do well when the data is not cleaned up, which is also in one of the previous conversations we had. This is also a problem that you mentioned. And since big law operates at scale, that problem is also scaled. Yeah, but
I
very
think it's
interested.
a misunderstanding to assume that lawyers are well organized, and that their data is organized as well. And I think that that really is the first hurdle that anybody looking to implement AI should address. Because if your own data sanitation procedures aren't in place, whether they be naming conventions or just knowing what folder they're stored in, then adding that AI layer to an already messy database is just going to compound problems that you're already having. So taking the time to go through your data, see where everything's living, because you're going to eventually have to be able to map and audit that AI use. So the cleaner
Mhm.
your databases, the cleaner your procedures are, the easier it's going to be to reconstruct it if, God forbid, you have to defend its use in court, which we're heading towards, I think, this year and definitely next.
That's interesting because early in the days when Gen AI appeared, 2 years ago, how did big law within the incubators, on which use cases was it adopted? Did they fall under the hype that now you don't have to clean up the data anymore because you can just plug generative AI in? And is it already like widely recognized that that is not the case, that the data is still very important?
No, I think that the adoption is definitely accelerating. You see, I think let me see if I have the figures here, that the UK estimated 85% of lawyers see AI as relevant. 75% of firms in the UK large firms in the UK are using it, but only about 30% of mid-size. And I think that that's definitely an opportunity lost because big or smaller firms are often in a better position to quickly pivot to
Mhm.
analyze their procedures. Because if you think about, let's say, a conflicts intake system, that's going to touch your billing software, that's going to touch your records management. And some of those projects can take a year, 2 years to implement to be able to check all the boxes with the different departments, get the committees to sign off, get the stakeholders to agree to the spend. So you're able to pivot, move to determine what is working, what isn't working a lot quicker, I think, in the
Yeah.
mid-size and the small size firms. But to your question of whether it's being used in like securities, I think it is. I haven't had a chance to use one on a use case with the AI component, but using the machine learning AI of 6 years ago, it's so it's so tempting to think that I can enter a prompt, I can trust the response, but knowing and being able to have the understanding of how AI works, understanding the probabilistic nature when lawyers are inherently deterministic. Um, it's a paradigm shift, and that requires training. And I think that that's another under utilized function of the risk management departments, the IT within law firms, to explain that here's our new tool. Do you know how to use it before we set you loose to verify your own work when you don't even know where the pitfalls could fall within your workflow?
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting because, like, I hear we both read and we've been talking about how many hallucinations are popping up, how many cases where the fake citations were used on trials, and I'm wondering more and more before. Did lawyers always check what the associates prepared?
Well,
That's
so yes, I don't see how you can prepare to argue a case in court without having read it. So whether it was a physical binder with numbered tabs going to court or whether it was an electronic binder, I would have every case ready. So in case I was asked a question on that case, I'd be able to answer it. So
yeah,
it's a lack of diligence, and eventually we've already seen sanctions which have been very low. I think like 5,000,
yeah,
but as the state bars start to consider ABA Opinion 512, which we've talked about, which highlights the importance of competency, understanding how the tool works, not necessarily being an expert, but knowing its capabilities, its limitations, whether it's through your firm or whether it's through an outside professional to tell you what tools do what well. Those are things that obviously for the people who have been submitting hallucinated cases isn't being done. But in law firms, we used to have the library that would shepherdize cases, that would check for recency if they've been negatively interpreted by a subsequent court. But I think the hallucination problem, in my opinion, has something to do with the data set that it's being trained on. Because if you think about opening up the database to the best and the worst of legal opinions, then how is AI supposed to determine the difference between a good and a bad argument?
true.
So firms being able to train it on their use or their precedent, I think is very important. But also, I th- I'm surprised, and there may be a tool out there, but to catalog the case law that you have used in an internal database, because you tend to use the same cases over and over again. So if you don't need to reinvent the wheel, then don't think that you need to use AI just because it's shiny, new, and you think that it's going to create all these efficiencies, which it can in research,
Yeah.
but you need to still go through that process of reading the case that you're going to be relying on as just a baseline.
Yeah, interesting. And two things you said. So one, you got to know how to use it, and I believe that that's also according to ABBA ethics, modern ethics rules. One of the defined competencies of law, right? Of knowing the technology, of knowing the tools that you use. So you are kind of responsible for um, checking the output, but so the other thing that you mentioned when goes to integrating AI with your workflows and organizing the foundation, because when you mentioned that, like, organizing your case files in a knowledge base, that is already cleaning up the data and organizing it in a certain way, preferably following some naming conventions. And when I work with law firms, sometimes it's kind of hard to switch that mentality from let's just plug AI in to, well, actually, we have to touch the data. But once we do touch the data, no, I'm not going to say most of the times, but a lot of times, there is no need for AI. A lot of times organizing the data has massive impacts on their reducing the time to search through things, or sometimes they search and they don't find because they have files named 01 and 02.
Right.
So I mean, no matter how good the AI is, it's not going to be able to know that it needs to look into this file because it will see, oh, 01, that doesn't make sense for what the user asked, and it will pass it. So it will not even take it into consideration. So it's not really included in the search that you do with AI through your documents. Hence, how important it is to clean it up. But if we tie it back a little bit to big law, those are the problems that, yeah, we see in big law, I guess, at scale. But also smaller firms, in-house teams, they all experience them. And how do you see those problems being handled and addressed in big law? And is that approach successful or not? How do you think about it?
Can you ask that again, please?
So the approach of like cleaning up, handling the data before you go into like automating anything, how successful is that in big law? How do they have like mechanisms to kind of handle that already? Since you mentioned that like you were running an AI incubator 6 years ago already.
So I'll say that different firms are better at it than others. I've been at firms where there was a very robust document management, diligence on the part of the attorneys as well as the in-house staff. And then I have been in others where it was a struggle to find a waiver or an engagement letter.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is a spectrum, but it requires a lot of diligence. And because a lot of our legal practice is devoted to the deliverable and not necessarily towards internal maintenance, I think we miss a lot of opportunities to do pre-mortems before a deal to say, okay, here's the things that we kind of want to capture to process throughout this deal, and then doing a post-mortem after it, whether it's tagging relevant information, cataloging it, taking that administrative step as part of your practice, even though you're not necessarily able to bill it, I think is really important. And I don't know, we haven't touched on this yet, but we were talking about the training of data, and that I think raises the problem of our engagement letters with our clients.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, so larger companies, you'll have outside counsel guidelines, which may be reviewed internally by the company every year to address various risks. So AI is popping up in a lot of these outside counsel guidelines now to specifically say, do not train based on our information unless you obtain a waiver for a specific purpose. But then you have engagement letters that may be 5 years old, which never anticipated the use of client data. So the administrative task of, in order to ethically be able to use that data to go back to the client and again to be able to understand the material risks and limitations adequately enough to explain that to the client so their consent is actually informed to their use of
Yeah.
that data, understanding the privacy risks, and then ultimately understanding the privilege risks, because I think we're just one data breach away from that trust component being breached. And as you've seen, that trust is one of the, I think, the most important things that we're looking for now in the implementation and utilization of AI. And that trust can be lost very quickly. So in a law firm, one bad use case could delay implementation for a year.
Yeah.
Um, but if you
Yeah.
have a department which understands that it's part of a learning curve, that you may see short-term inefficiencies while you're building out the process. And that was something that Keenan Spalding was very good about, just giving us the freedom. I actually think that it was a firm-wide initiative, and it was kind of like a Shark Tank idea. And so different people throughout the firm, staff, attorneys, were able to submit proposals. And this was something that the firm thought enough about to invest the time, the resources in knowing that we were going to have to learn, we were going to be taking time away from our billable hours to be analyzing these AI tools, to work with onboarding them, to learn how they function. And, that's not a small investment for firms when the entire ecosystem of firms is largely based on the billable hour because it's the easiest metric to be able to determine efficiency. But
Mhm.
talking about small firm implementations, I think if they just take one function at a time, billing's a great one that you could add an AI layer to analyze, to be able to better predict future estimates for how much a deal is going to cost. So even if the client may be paying a little bit more, at least they know they have a greater degree of certainty of what that figure is based on, whether it be past deal metrics, document count, whatever it is. But just taking, again, mapping out your flow, seeing where your
Yeah,
inefficiencies are, and
yeah,
focusing on those inefficiencies first. And then once those are implemented and you see the positive return on that, you've already mapped out the process. You move on to the next layer, whether it's legal
yeah,
research, document management, but
yeah.
figuring out a way to have it communicate and interact and integrate with your system in a way that doesn't add an additional barrier for lawyers to be able to do their work. So when I was at Luminance, that's something that I was interested in, was working with the design team on the user interface. Like, if a lawyer has to go through these number of steps to be able to accomplish what they could have accomplished the old way, then it's not going to happen. So I think that the technology is pretty well established now. So really it's going to be a user interface, how well it integrates within a firm's culture, within their existing practices, and people like
Yeah.
you that are able to offer a new lens of that this legacy way may be perfectly fine, but it could be so much better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do see quite some. So I see like main usage of generative AI is focused on conversational way because that's what people understand and that's what people can see. So it's an experience. But to be able to really be effective in that, you need to know a lot about how to communicate with it. You've mentioned about hallucinations. You mentioned training data sets, but those are things out of our control. What data the model is trained. I mean, I think that like vast majority of the applications out there, of the tools out there, are using either OpenAI's AI models or Anthropic's AI, or maybe Google's. So those three providers are taking the vast majority of the market. So basically, you don't have the control over the data that it's being trained on. Worse, even, you don't have an overview, you don't have an insight into the data that it was trained on. Think of the vast internet, because this is, and I'm not exaggerating. So,
The
like, this
entire
is what it is.
internet.
Yeah. Today I was talking with a security expert, and he was saying that they identified a lot of groups that are pushing malicious data on the internet for the sole purpose of LLMs picking that up and being trained on. So, this is where we're kind of going. And trusting those tools and thinking, oh, now this thing is here that can do the job for me or part of the job for me, that's not the way to go. The way to work around those limits and learn that is the way to go. Hence, another usage of AI, because you have this visible AI through conversational interface, and you have an invisible AI that runs behind the process, and you don't know, you never see, you don't have to communicate, so you cannot make an error when communicating, right? So just to give you like a quick example, and that was actually done in 2 weeks. I did the scoping for a small firm. It's there's two managing partners, and they have subcontractors, but mainly do the job themselves. So a lot of admin overhead, and their engagements are not long, so they get a lot of clients in and out, and there's a lot of repetitive work. So basically, imagine just a form. In that form, a client can drop in their contract and their pay slips. So you have a flow where immediately those pay slips and the contract end up in the correct folders. And then when they're there, which is already half of the job done, because most lawyers don't really have time to kind of think of those naming conventions and keep up the structure all the time. So that's one thing. The second, then you use AI to run this contract through. And because it's such a small task for the AI, you can use small local models. You don't have to use GPT-4 or Claude.
Yep.
So your data doesn't leave your possession. And the AI only goes through the contract and checks, oh, this is the name of the person, boom, fills in the name of the person in the template. Here's the social security, boom. Here's the email, boom. You can use that information later on to even automate billing. Can be automated every month. An invoice is created from this.
Well, and
So
those take the
like,
tasks away from lawyers that they hate doing, the
yeah,
administrative
exactly.
components. They
Yeah,
hate and keeping track of their time. I was awful at it because I was usually working on multiple things at one time. But
yeah, that's a
taking
great example.
taking
Yeah.
document management, if you work that into your intake system, so if you need an engagement letter, if you need a waiver, then once that form is submitted, it being mapped to whatever portion of your document management system automatically without relying on a human to then go save it or save these email logs that accompany, the request that you're working on. So handling a lot of that administrative work up front, I think really helps with the audit trail later on because you have less
Sure.
places that you have to look. So,
Hmm.
and I think that everyone's watching OpenAI New York Times case pretty closely because I think it's going to have major implications on discovery. We saw it with e-discovery and metadata. So I'm not entirely sure how that's going to look with AI as when you have the prompts and you have the reasoning going behind the generated content. That's going to be very interesting to watch. And I think it's causing concerns for firms because it's such an area of uncertainty. Why would you create all of this data that, number one, you don't understand where it's going, how it's being used, how it's being stored, but you may then be later required to explain that.
Yeah.
And if you don't
Yeah.
have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that, then you're opening yourself up for a lot of liability later on.
Yeah, and I feel like big law actually is in a little bit of a better position here because they can throw,
They have the
yeah,
resources.
headcount at it. Yes, exactly. And imagine like we both know the complexity of building a technical evaluation system, but you gotta kind of have it because you're liable. Even in the disclosure agreements of those big AI providers, it's disclosed that the AI can give false answers. So it's on your side to validate this. On the other hand, if you don't want data retention, I mean, you gotta have a system that is going to observe, monitor, log. That's another system to build on top of that. So you're not building one system, you're building three. So in that case, I don't think that like smaller ones are in a good position to be able to achieve this because it's you do have to have regular revenue, regular stream of cash going into those things.
So Wells Fargo just did a survey that says rates are up about 9%, but revenues for law firms are up about 11. So the cost savings that are being introduced by AI aren't matching the savings that are being passed along to the clients. And that may just be a short-term phenomenon while they're recouping their investment costs. But I thought that was an interesting figure. But we were talking about the duty of competence to understand.
Yeah,
We also have a duty to supervise both our lawyer and our
yeah,
non-lawyer staff. And that's an important component because the ethical obligation then flows to senior leaders within the law firm, sometimes attaching the ethical violation to them for their failure to supervise, adequately train, adequately monitor. Um, because, so we saw with GPT 4.5 to 5, there was a marked difference. So, what does the reevaluation of the benchmarking and the compliance look like after each of these updates? Because it doesn't remain static. It's not just you have a year, then at the end of the year you reevaluate it, because there's
Yeah.
different nuances with each of these updates that are going to interrupt the continuity of your workflow in some cases. If you're working on a long-term project that's specific to, we saw people getting very attached to their 4.5 personas,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
when those went away, it made them get in their feelings. So
Yeah.
there is that kind of psychological attachment to becoming comfortable with the way you work and knowing that that workflow is not going to be interrupted.
Yeah, but it's gonna be because if you depend on
Of
those
course it
models and
is.
they deprecate one of them, your prompt doesn't work like it did yesterday, and it happened overnight, and you don't have control.
Well,
So
and different
that's
people's prompts are going to deliver different responses. So, two
yes,
lawyers in the same practice group could ask the same question in completely different ways and receive different answers. So,
yeah,
again, training lawyers on prompting.
yeah,
It's not sexy, but it's necessary. We see entire job titles being created around prompt, attorney
yeah,
prompt
yeah.
engineers, because
Really, attorney prompt engineers.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. Interesting.
seeking, yeah, to improve current prompting procedures. So
Yeah.
determining better prompts to produce better results, maybe with less hallucinations, capturing different data, rather than, just taking a screenshot of something and say, write an article on this. Being able to have a method behind the madness. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of companies are creating jobs not necessarily knowing exactly the function that they need the person to fulfill. They just know that they need somebody focused on it. And
Hmm.
so I think we're going to see a lot of these roles become more defined and better compensated within law firms, because you have to be able to compensate the talent necessary to be able to handle both the technical aspect of it, but also the law aspect. So knowing how litigation life cycle works, knowing how the securitization practice group, the leverage finance practice groups work, and how their work again fits with that particular use case. And that requires a different kind of lawyer that merges that tech background, or that's at least able, for instance, in litigation, being able to put an AI expert on the stand and being able to communicate with them and have them communicate in a way that a jury would be able to understand.
Hmm.
And I think that that's the approach you should be
Yeah.
taking in training, is that you should be able to explain, well, you have to be able to explain this to your clients to obtain their informed consent. And I think that there's been more of a push towards implementation first, training later. And that's why we've
Yeah.
seen the rise in sanctions, because there was just an expectation that it's going to produce, accuracy in the demos was shown to be 95, 98%. So I'm comfortable with that. I was speaking with someone the other day in conversations. I anticipate that about 10% of what I hear is not necessarily the entire truth. And that's
Exactly.
generally okay for certain use cases. In some cases, 95% accuracy is totally fine. But
Yeah.
when you're basing something on case law, and it's not based in reality, then that's a problem. But I also find it a problem. So, for instance, I think we talked about the widely circulated use case after the 5.0 update, where somebody asked ChatGPT to what 1.9 minus 1.11 was. And it came up with the wrong answer because it interpreted 1.11 to be larger than 1.9. So then you think, well, we definitely can't trust it in financial modeling yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are we going to use it in SEC filings? So
Yeah.
there's
Mm.
a level of understanding of the limitations that we haven't quite created the parameters for. Eventually, insurers, regulators, the state bars are going to force it.
Yeah. Yes, so this is exactly one thing that's why I checked the notes before, because I knew that there is one thing that we didn't mention yet, and it's in the insurance part. Just before we go into that, you mentioned that it gave the wrong calculation because LLMs are not good in mathematics. They're good in predicting, which is not good in mathematics. So how they made those models. So now I also believe that we kind of reached a plateau for a little while in how fast those models are going to improve. And now it's more on the engineering side of the spectrum. So it's again moving more towards the engineering and less artificial intelligence. What do I mean by that? So those models work in a way where there's like this decision-making layer. Where are they going to go in their thinking further before they go and they give an answer? And they see, and this is where it failed, they see the question is about calculation, and they don't go and say, okay, let's give this question to the artificial intelligence. They go and they say, let's give this question to the calculator tool. And then the calculator tool calculates it, gives it back, and then LLM doesn't just give out the calculation, the number, but it adds a sentence, kind of an explanation, right? Because it's a conversational
Right.
one. So the actual calculation is not done by the model. So here in this case, that decision-making layer, where is it going to go, failed. And this is what we saw widely with ChatGPT 5 when it came out first. That routing layer was constantly wrong. It was
Right.
going to the thinking model, not calling the tools that it should.
Well, and we
A
see it
lot
in
of
things
those
as
things.
simple as image generation, being able to overlay text or generating a PDF document that's different from the output. And it's like you're saying, those different workflows, whether it's communicating with a calculator tool or whether it's text generation, that's still being ironed out. But I've talked to a lot of really smart people that are working on the benchmarks for these tools that have clear-cut answers. Was this a correct response in case laws? So working with some people in Amsterdam, looking at now incorporating US law, because US law has its own peculiarities with,
Yes.
municipalities, appellate courts, the Supreme Court in New York not necessarily being the highest court, like different things like that. And being able to determine, what did this case say what the AI said it said? Like
Yeah.
those are things that we can do, and the companies that are doing it better are going to be the ones that secure the trust in that space. Um, but again, we should resist the temptation to just blindly trust whatever is being given to us. But hopefully, as these tools do become better, double checking the work is going to be a lot easier, whether it's in the
Yeah.
user interface where it's referencing a case. You have a separate
Yeah,
screen that
exactly.
pulls up the exact portion that it's referencing, instead of the clicking on the link for the attachment, then going and finding the case, figuring out if it did say what it did. So there's definitely a lot of tools that I think are going to be developed that are addressing those pain points that we're seeing now.
Yeah, very interesting. And let's say I'm a managing partner that, which this is an average, that has 10 AI tools piloting in the firm at the same time. And how should I think about communicating this to my clients? What are the things that I do have to disclose? Not just, okay, hey guys, I'm using AI, your data is being processed by AI, but it goes deeper than that, right?
It does. Well, I think it starts with understanding what your client wants. If your client doesn't want it to be used, then that's part of your client relationship, to understand your client's needs, where it would be beneficial for them, but ultimately respecting their decision. But in terms of disclosure, what happens if there is a data breach? How is their data being safeguarded against something that may compromise their confidentiality or their attorney-client privilege? Um,
Mhm.
because work product, attorney-client privilege are some of the foundations of that trust between the attorney and the client. So, I mean, we're just, like I said, one case away from seeing that compromised, and the fallouts of that, I think, are going to trickle across law firms. But having those mechanisms, and you probably can speak more to the data security and cybersecurity components of it than I can, but having those conversations with IT, with your data privacy department, to be able to understand where those vulnerabilities are, and to be able to explain those to the firm at large, but ultimately to the client, so they can understand that the risks for them don't outweigh the benefits. So in that particular case, they're comfortable with using it. For
Yeah.
certain deals that may be more sensitive, it may not be worth the risk to gamble on something that's in its infancy. Um, so yeah, I think it's a conversation about understanding the benefits and the potential risks of using that technology if the worst case scenario happens.
As a managing partner, and I have to think a lot about more things than just buying a tool. I have to still keep the old processes, but then also introduce new ones and all that stuff.
Exactly, and I think that that goes to the temptation of lawyers to use the resources and tools that are available to them and not necessarily understanding the parameters that the firm and the client have agreed to the representation. So being able to have that information readily available and digestible by attorneys that are going to be working on these cases. So you get staffed on a case, you're provided, here are the client's guidelines. Whether or not you have the client, the attorney read every page of that, I don't think that's necessary, but to be able to distill it down to these are the specific client requirements that need to be in place, and to have the attorneys take that level of responsibility on what can and can't be used. I still can't understand um the attorneys that I've heard that have been using like medical records in open AI, like Chat GPT. I don't think that that's, common practice in law firms, but it happens. And so the understanding of how a tool anonymizes data, what the vendor does to segment data apart, and whether or not that segmented data is then used in their training data as opposed to the whole set, and whether or not that circumvents some of those privacy concerns that you've tried to address in contracting with that vendor.
Yeah, very interesting. And how do you think, because I know this is a topic you know a lot about, how do you think insurers are going to are looking at this right now, and where is it going with them including the insurance for AI risks in the premiums?
Actually, I had a conversation about this last night about whether or not it was going to be taken out of companies' cybersecurity policies, because we've already seen insurers like Lloyd's of London come out with specific AI specific insurance options. So, as these companies begin to do what they do best, and that's obtain data points on risk losses, then they're going to be better able to quantify that. And then the premiums for firms are going to some extent, be dependent on the robustness of their internal practices and procedures. So I think Lloyd's of London's just came out this year, so maybe the extent of their data isn't what it will be in the next 2 years, but we're also going to see at the end of this year a bunch of SEC filings with companies 10Ks that are either, in past years, I don't think I've seen hardly any references to hallucinations. They may be data inaccuracies or failures, things like that. But seeing how these things are now going to be showing up in front of regulators, and then having the regulators and maybe even more so the insurers drive the robustness of implementation and the safety procedures within law firms to be able to show here's where the human in the loop was. Here's the checkbox where they verified that they reviewed this case and it says what it says. However, that may look, because it's going to have to go beyond your vendor questionnaires. It's going to
Hmm.
go into your data management practices. Law firms typically don't allow audits of their systems, but for certain security things, that's done in practice. So, what that's going to look like in terms of their AI compliance
Yeah.
is going to be interesting to track over the next year or two.
Yeah, very interesting. And do you think that having some sort of internal processes as a firm, or maybe even an in-house team, for how to evaluate AI, but not just in how accurate is the answer that it gives us, but within the context of the whole environment, and how safe it is to use it, what are your blind spots, those kind of procedures. Do you think that we're going to see that more and more in practice, that law firms are going to establish them within?
I think they'll have to, because all goes into their diligence of competency to understand the tool, but also to safeguard their client's confidential information. Um, so I think that that's already a requirement. It should be done in tandem with any AI use, and I think that to the vast extent it is. How detailed or in depth those procedures are is a mixed bag. I was a little troubled by the way that I saw it being used in practice and the level of training being offered. I think with something with the capability of presenting so much risk and liability to firms and clients, I don't see how you can't take that seriously enough to verify that your users understand how to use the tool, whether it's a quiz at the end of your security questionnaire to know, do not put this kind of data in this. If you're using Copilot, then these are the primary use cases where it's the most beneficial. Do not use this tool for this. I think it's going to need to get that granular and have some level of
Yeah.
competency testing for their users, whether it's a
Do you,
certification, or whether I don't know. What do you see it in any of your work?
how do they handle that? Yeah, not very structurally. They do try to educate themselves, some more than the others. Some try to spread that knowledge along amongst the others, but it's mainly focused on what kind of a prompt can I write. And I see a lot of assembling their own prompt libraries or repositories that can be then shared
Very smart.
between colleagues. But that's again all on the implementational perspective, right? I don't see really any kind of playbooks or processes written out or policies on how it should be used, what kind of data should go in there and what shouldn't, how should we communicate with the client that we used it. Because I think that most of them are aware that, especially the ones in Europe, that they can't really use ChatGPT for client data because the data is being sent overseas. The data is being stored, analyzed, used for research. It literally is disclosed in the in OpenAI's policy. So I don't see a lot of motivation for actually disclosing those things. But when you put into the equation the insurers, right? I think that is all what they're going to be looking at as well. And whether do you have the governance, the policies? Do you know what to do in a case where something goes wrong? When a client demands their data to be redacted, what is your procedure then? Who do you call?
Right.
Those things, yeah, I see a lack of that. I see we're still in the hype where we're all focused on we can let AI in 3 minutes, we can have an AI lawyer that is going to do our job. I see this is still like the primary discussion. Um, and hallucinations from the perspective of don't use AI because it has hallucinations, which doesn't help anyone. Not the people that are against it, not the people that are for it. It's like I'm missing how do we work around it and how do we structure this in awareness of how AI should be treated and how do we put it in policies. And yeah, I see the lack of that. Yeah.
And there's a couple of reports about shadow adoption of
Yeah.
different AI tools, which introduces a whole different aspect of liability because then the data is completely out of the firm's control. It could be on
Mhm.
somebody's personal device
Mhm.
that's then never within the firm's orbit. Again, as part of your training,
Yeah.
emphasize what can and can't be done. But I think that you're right that just saying that it has hallucinations, we don't want to use it isn't the right approach because there's so many things that it's good at. For instance, going into a litigation, being able to anticipate opposing counsel's arguments, being
Mhm.
able to have that dialogue back and forth. I love dictating emails and things like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
So So being able
Saves so
to
much time, right?
dictate a
Dictation.
train of
Yeah,
thought or a response to a client's emails,
yeah,
a partner being able to, get a 4 paragraph email, maybe not have time to review it right now. What are, my action items? What is, give me a summary. Things like that are very beneficial, even if it is like 90%, 95%, just depending on the risk that you're willing to take. If it's not that important of an email, but you want to acknowledge response, then that's a huge time saving because you don't have to go through that, first level of drafting to be
true.
able to generate your response and to keep the ball moving. So
Yeah,
there's definitely a lot of very good use cases. And I still think that research is another great use case. So, for instance, why the case citations aren't made static to where these
yeah,
aren't subject to probability. This is always going to be the same. This case says that this is the citation, this is what is generated. That seems like it would be a simpler fix, but I don't know if it goes into the training of, again, in law school, we learned the issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, IRAC method. So whether or not these LLMs are being trained in the same way that lawyers are being taught to think and analyze cases, could be completely different from the way that they've been trained to analyze financial reports or things like that. So
yeah,
being
yeah.
able to tailor what you're looking for with the right tool, I think that's something that you're doing, and I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and you're right. Very different use cases, very different tools. In finances, you have a lot of numbers, you have a lot of tables. In law, you don't have that much of that. In healthcare, you have small labels and stuff. You need a lot of recognition. Um, so, yeah, being able to have, and that's where I see the future going actually. Um, and it's good for two things. We need more specialized models and more specialized, domain specialized systems, which does two things. On one hand, we don't need such big models. We can have smaller models, which is cheaper by default. And with that, that plays well for data privacy, because if you have small models, you can run them on your laptop, you can run them on your server, much easier than the big ones. And there you have control over your data, so we're handling a lot of privacy risks here. However, we still need to train people on how to use them. And like, it's not just what it's safe to send because the data is sent who knows where, but what is it safe, how is it safe to read what it generates? What can I take for, yeah, okay, that sounds pretty well, or no, 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 I have to double check that? What is the framework, what is the mechanism that I develop in my head to be able to do that at scale? Those are the things that we still need to kind of learn, I think, as a society.
And it's going to be interesting to see how law schools address this issue because, on one
Oh yes.
hand, you don't want your students to be able to generate their entire essay with AI. And on the opposite side, you have partners expecting new graduates to be able to be proficient, or at least more proficient than them, in using AI. So
Mhm.
I think it's going to have to start at law schools, being able to change that mentality of this is the way law has always been practiced and this is the way that it's going to continue to be practiced, as opposed to now you have this tool available to you like a calculator. It's good for certain things, it's not good for certain things, but still maintaining that ability to develop your critical thinking. Because I think one thing a lot of partners that I've talked to are worried about is that some people are putting first, second, third year law tasks to AI to complete, and then to first, second, third your associates to verify, without having the foundation to be able to understand what they're verifying and why. But it also then goes to business continuity, that what happens if these tools go down and they're so embedded into your
That,
workflow? How do
that's
you
true.
handle that when you've relied so heavily on them for XYZ function?
Hmm.
We
Yeah.
saw it when Chat GPT went down and LinkedIn posts went down by what, 500%,
Yeah. Yeah,
because
did you
nobody
that?
had anything original
That
to
was
say.
crazy.
It's-
Nobody
I
nobody
found it
write
quite
their own
I
post
found it quite
anymore.
humorous.
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
shows how reliant we're becoming on it for everyday tasks. This is a little
Mm,
bit off topic, but I was talking with a good friend who's a behavioral psychologist for children and talking about the number of patients that were using ChatGPT just to be able to communicate in text messages with each other. And so that's a troubling shift. So
yeah,
still
yeah.
maintaining, but hopefully with all of the efficiency that we're saving, we're able to not only have a better work-life balance, but more collaboration with the client. If you're not
Mhm.
spending all of your time doing the legal work, then you become more a business partner, understanding what your clients' wants, needs, fears are, and then be able to develop that relationship because law firms have such a large amount of data on their clients that could be used to help make their representation of those clients more efficient if that data is maintained in a way that makes it readily accessible. So, if you're working with somebody on a bankruptcy deal, you have another deal a year later that may not be in the same sphere, but touches on a lot of the same data points that you've already had categorized in a particular way that makes them more accessible so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, through discovery. It could be a supplementation to your existing records, but also being able to provide insights to your clients on developments in the law because they know that this is of particular importance to them. You dealt with this in a prior deal, then generating seemingly unrelated cases from the way that you manage their data in a way that was then able to be utilized by them later.
Mm. And I think it's a very interesting thought about law schools, how they're going to handle that. Because AI can be used in two ways. It can make things faster, quicker, more comfortable for you. And on the other hand, it can make you do things that you do better if you use it to challenge you. Um, I read an interesting article, again off topic. I mean, yeah, that one's off topic as well, but it's about engineers and Google. So I think it was Google or Meta. Yeah. So basically, they're allowing their engineers in the technical exams. So when you apply for a job with them,
Mhm.
you get a couple of technical assessments and you kind of complete them, and usually one of them is a 2 or 3 hour live coding assessment where you share your screen and you code. They allow the usage of coding AI tools for that because it's still, if you don't know anything about code, you can get something that kind of looks like something, but the system behind is full. It's like Swiss cheese, full of holes, and it only waits. You get 500 users on that system, it's gonna collapse. So somebody that knows nothing about coding, or a junior, can get much less from AI in building a system than a senior, than somebody that knows a lot about AI, because they can use AI to challenge. Oh, but I think that this assumption that you did is wrong because of this and that. Can you please double check that? So they can use it better. I feel it's the same with law school students. If you use it to make something for you, and it's the same task as a senior attorney would get, I think the results would be much different. But you can use it to learn faster. It's just that most of the people kind of use it to stay in their comfort zones, not to push themselves out of the comfort zones.
Well, and you've seen with Chat GPT-5, the study and learn, I forget what it's called, function. So say you were a first, second year associate and you get something and you have absolutely no idea how to complete it. That's something that without disclosing client data, again, the training aspect, because you can create generalized things that don't compromise client confidentiality because you can't identify the client based on what you've given the system. But if you say, I need to create an NDA in New Jersey, if you don't have the precedent, can you identify the relevant laws, a few cases? At least that then gives you a springboard to learn it, but not have to spend the time parsing the different ways and areas that you aren't as proficient to identify that you're lacking.
Yeah, Jason. How do you see the future when it comes to this? Are we going to be using AI more to make our lives easier and make ourselves lazier? Or are we gonna use it to push ourselves to be better?
Well, I think we'll use it as long as it makes financial sense to do so, because I think we're reaching an inflection point. One of the things that I did during this research project was the environmental impacts. So,
Yeah,
all the data processing facilities that need to be built in order to maintain this level of usage. And then you see all of the another going back to trust is you have all of these AI companies with these astronomical valuations, and yet they're not turning a profit and it's not sustainable in the long run. So who's going to be around in the next 1, 2 years is going to be really important, because I'm looking towards quantum computing still. I
yeah,
think that
yeah.
it's on the horizon. So in a lot of ways, the things that we're talking about in terms of data security and cybersecurity are going to drastically change when we add quantum computing into the component. So that will be interesting. But yeah, what about you? Where do you
How
see it?
do I how do I see it? I must say I'm not. I like to call myself a realist. Some might think I have some pessimistic views, but I see most of the people today in whatever they do, they like to stay in comfort zones. That's why there's a small percentage of overachievers and there's a large percentage of people that are not. And I see that there's a pattern, psychological pattern that is developed throughout the life of staying in a comfort zone. And now you get this tool that for most of the things that you didn't know how to do, with one prompt, makes you do them on a kind of okay level. So you're all of a sudden you have gained so many powers and it's enough and it makes your life easier. It does your recipe, it tells you which show to check. You don't have to go and even do your Google search anymore. You just ask it.
And that is an interesting psychological effect of a lot degrading your lack of confidence. If you're constantly asking a tool for validation that this course of action is correct, this is the right response, then being able to be confident in yourself to do it without those kind of prompts. That's I mean, that's a critical thinking skill that I think we need to be on the lookout for degrading.
Yeah, yes. And talking about the grading, I don't think a lot of people are really aware of this concept of psychopathy with those AI models. Basically, it kind of tells you everything you wanted. So just test it. Just for our viewers, just test it. Be a little bit opinionated when you ask it something, and then ask it the other way around, and be also
Multiple, yeah,
opinionated in
that's
that.
a very good
Yeah.
point. Ask it a lot of different ways, and ask it in to act as a different kind of interpreter. So thinking as a contract lawyer in Delaware, do X, look for XYZ, or as an ethicist, what do you see the weaknesses in this argument being? So not just asking for what is the answer, but maybe what isn't the answer and why, to be able
Yeah.
to do those checks. And going back to verifying accuracy, it's not the ideal option, but at least putting it in a second tool to say, what are the issues with this? Are there any hallucinated citations? Even if you catch one or two, then it's still better than nothing. It doesn't replace your due diligence requirement, but if you have a brief that came in right before the deadline and you're the partner reviewing it, having a tool available to be able to do a final check, whether it's jeopardizing or whatever, I think is going to be very beneficial.
And that's where I see a big opportunity on the legal tech market. Being able to come up with tools like this that can be connected to many different databases of citations and really do the keyword check real quick of what
But being
AI
narrowed
came
to a
up with.
specific function. Like you were
Yeah,
saying, have these smaller AIs dedicated to a specific function. So the chance for them drifting and failing to maintain the fidelity in their answer decreases because it's not focused on reasoning. And I think this is something that we
yeah.
spoke about, is the difference between AI's ability to understand and interpret and its ability to reason. The first portion is largely dependent on the user, which is why we said that two people can receive two completely different responses. So, its reasoning may be that of a middle schooler, while its understanding may be that of a middle schooler, while its reasoning could be, PhD level. It's just
Yeah.
again understanding what it's doing when you are giving it a prompt and how it's arriving at its output based on probabilities of what's sequentially falling next in line. And I think that that understanding helps you better understand where the pitfalls creep in the
Yeah.
workflow, but a lot of it's trial and error. I've done a lot of experiments, I'll call them, where I've done something first without AI to see how long it takes me, the process, and then I'll do it as if I never did that first project to see what it takes for me to go through AI to get the same result. And that's a
Hmm.
really helpful exercise because
Yeah.
it causes you to reverse engineer your own work product for a particular application to see where it isn't meeting those expectations.
True. And when you go about breaking things down and really clearly explaining them, you might as well see some improvement opportunities over your own manual process. So maybe even at that point, AI won't help you, but you will help yourself because you'll see how to do it much more efficiently.
Absolutely.
That's also a thing that I see as a side effect of people starting to break down into smaller sub instructions.
And I think that that's one of the good things about AI is it's causing law firms to take a much closer and more deliberate approach to
Mhm.
mapping their workflows, to seeing when this button is pushed, this then goes here and it interacts with this system and this system. So that infrastructure for larger firms is already built in because of the various billing systems, securities, ethical walls that need to be in place. So that's another, I think, important component of AI use is going to be working with the conflicts department to
Mhm.
establish ethical walls. Because if you are using another client's data in a training set where there is a conflict, being able to not draw on that confidential information of the other client in the representation of the conflicted client, that becomes a lot more difficult. And you
Yeah.
really need to have somebody that understands the document management system as
Yeah.
well as the security systems to prevent lawyers from overlapping teams. So I mentioned that I went to that industry meeting. I think what they're doing over at Connexo and Eversheds is really interesting. But they had a bunch of people from Meta, Intel, NCR, and just having that different perspective of here's not necessarily specifically what we're doing, but the kind of questions that we are looking at AI to potentially answer and the different functions within organizations as well as law firms. Because as you said, now that everyone has this increased knowledge base and almost an overconfidence in the ability to then act on that information that they're given, we hear that AI is going to replace all lawyers. So once you have everyone that starts to represent themselves in court, we're going to see a lot more, hallucinated citations, and
Yeah.
it's going to cause a really difficult predicament for the judiciary that are
Yeah.
already overburdened in their workload and now
Yeah.
having to take time to figure out what's real and what's not as part of everyday litigation practice. In some cases, I think that AI has the potential to decrease the time that it's going to see required for resolution of some of these cases. And I think that that's going to be really appreciated by the judiciary. But then again, at the
Yeah.
same time, they're dealing with the time on their dockets that are now being devoted to motions for sanctions. And eventually, we're going to reach a point where monetary sanctions aren't enough, that courts are going to impose more severe sanctions like striking of pleadings or default judgment.
Yeah.
We're heading into an interesting space where AI, with its capabilities, is going to be able to positively impact the efficiency of the judicial process. But at the same
Yeah.
time, we see that courts are having to devote resources to the improper use of AI, which has
Mm.
mostly been limited to sanctions so far. But courts have at their disposal other more severe sanctions, which unfortunately are going to negatively impact the clients. And then they then will have malpractice claims potentially
Yeah.
against the law firm for the improper use and the damages that they sustained because they didn't receive that adequate representation.
Yeah.
And that's again going to be something that insurers are going to be on the lookout for
Yeah.
because most malpractice insurance policies omit fines and sanctions as part of what's covered. So then that is going to fall on the partners within the law firm to pay for these uncovered losses. And that, I think, is another reason that you're seeing apprehension in the implementation because of the substantial risk that
Yeah.
currently isn't being paid by insurers. And the risks that then won't be paid by insurers that specifically address AI if it's not used in the proper way. So
Yeah.
one, hallucinated citation, that's one thing, but we just saw a case where before a regulatory body, somebody submitted two fake citations, the court pointed it out, and then they replaced it with two fake citations.
Yeah.
So at that point, it becomes less negligence and more along the lines of it is a misrepresentation to the court, and we have a duty of candor towards the tribunal that the things that we say are grounded in fact. Of course, we're going to zealously advocate for our clients and argue our strongest argument, but to the larger extent, those are based in fact. Whether it's a misinterpretation of a case, that's not specific to AI. You have lawyers that misinterpret cases all the time, which goes back into the training sets of AI being able to distinguish between
Yeah.
a good
Yeah.
summarization, a good representation of the holding, or a poor one. And now that we're seeing AI hallucinations make their way into court opinions and being caught after the fact, what that's going to do, setting the precedent, because you assume that a court order, it's gone through, multiple layers of verification, whether it's opposing counsel, it's the court clerk, it's ultimately the clerk or the judge that's signing the order. It's highlighting a lot of issues that are inherent to the legal profession to some extent, given the speed at which some of these things are being done. But being able to take a step back and say, this is where it makes sense now for us, given our current ecosystem, our current document management, our current risk profile,
Yeah.
insurers' preferences, and then working, with people like you who have a lot of experience across a lot of different platforms, a lot more than I do, to say, this is what this excels in. This is where you could benefit from testing it in this use case. And then being able to structure the use case in a way that provides the support and resources to the law firm implementing them to be able to realize that benefit after the pilot's done. And to some extent, support from the vendor substantially decreases and it becomes more reliant on the internal stakeholders and users to propel that use forward.
And it's going to be very interesting how it's going to play out because if you want to implement AI, you got to have a little bit of that systems thinking. How to break it down? In which function in my firm does it make the most sense? I see a lot of firms started looking into AI because AI is out there, and then that takes them to looking at their processes. But what I feel is we should kind of switch it around. Let's start looking at our processes and then let's start figuring out what is the solution, because it could be just like if we generalize three things, like you optimize the processes or you throw out the processes because they're outdated, you bring in new ones, or you use automation or you use AI on top of the automation. But starting at the most advanced spectrum, I don't think that is the way.
Well, even taking AI completely out of the picture, there's no way that you couldn't benefit from taking that personal look at yourself, that critical lens turned inwards to see, here's where we are, lacking in our data management or in our process management. We should reevaluate these workflows. I know of one law firm that recently implemented a contract management system,
Hmm.
and it may have been a week or so before rollout that a lot of the users in the various departments were able to test it, to be able to have that input and that insight into the implementation um, dialogue between the firm and the legal tech, to be able to say, no, these are the capabilities that we need it to have. These are the workflows that we needed to follow. And realizing that that hadn't been done during the entire onboarding of that
That's
tool.
very
So then after implementation, having to then go back and map the processes and map the different scenarios that a particular issue may go through on a regular basis ahead of time instead of having to then retrofit it after the fact because you don't understand the progression of whatever workflow you're dealing with. So
yeah,
even being
true.
able to have a flow chart, with scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario
Hmm.
3, being able to visualize that and
Yeah,
understand visually how your process works, it's going to be a lot easier for you to see where the potential breakdowns are, where the human in the loop component makes the most sense, where auditing should take place, what auditing should look at.
true.
But if you haven't put in that legwork on the front end, then it's really an uphill battle for you to overcome those after
True.
you've already implemented a system.
Yeah, that's why I don't know if I can say that or not, but yeah, I kind of refuse working on projects if a client has a very good idea what they need based on impressions and vibes, and they want me to build something for them. And I don't really like to go into this because I don't know whether this would make the most sense for you because I do not understand how you work. Between two law firms that are both two-person law firms and work in employment law, they have very different ways of working. One employment law that I know for years has been getting clients from the same two enterprises for wrongful terminations and things like this. So they have most of the cases from that two enterprises coming, so they can standardize their workflows. The other one has new clients every month. They can't standardize a lot of things. So trying to achieve the same because your friend at the dinner that has a law firm as well told you what they did is not a good way to go about it. And then being convinced and hiring people or buying tools for that is also not the way because you don't understand whether this would bring the most value to you.
I think that you see a lot of FOMO in law firms. There's a
Yeah.
fear of missing out on what really is a repackaged version. Well, no, I won't say that. There have been substantial improvements, but again, we saw machine learning 10 years ago, being able to have a lot of these capabilities and seeing that it didn't necessarily receive widespread implementation within law firms. But I think that the difference now is that this technology being available to the general population has made it more of an expectation of clients that, well, if I can, do this on my own, what benefit are you going to be providing me? And the same question
Mm-hmm.
goes to why it makes more sense to retain outside counsel as opposed to developing your in-house department to where it's
Yeah.
all just folded in as part of your life cycle of the deal. Because having legal involved and being able to address those inefficiencies that AI could help with later on as the deal progresses may become more easier for clients that have experiences with firms that aren't utilizing the technology to the extent it could be. So, for instance, with in the incubator project I was doing, you were able to see the client was able to have a dashboard. So they were able to see where in the review we were
Yeah.
able to segment out, we're just going to batch all of the NDAs or we're going to batch this, and being able to have that level of organization so you're not switching your brain between multiple documents. You're able to track the progression, how long you spent on each document. So you're able to provide better insight for the client into the value that you're providing, the status of the case, and maintaining that client trust that you're using your time wisely, but you're also benefiting from using these legal technology solutions, whether they're AI or not, in a responsible way.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting because I think that all of us have an idea where this is going to be going, even if we have a stronger idea or not such a strong, uh, yeah, belief of where it's going to be going. But in the past 6 months, I think I was proven wrong more times than in the past 5 years. So yeah, it's really
Well, at least you
it's
weren't alone.
yeah, at least there were a lot of smart people around me that were like, I didn't think that was gonna happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, very interesting space and really interesting to see. On one hand, I believe that law is one of the biggest candidates for AI implementation just because of the raw volume of text being used and the language. Language is the
Right.
tool with which the legal professionals operate with. But on the other hand, it has one of the biggest responsibilities to society. Therefore, the risks are the highest possible. I would say that in the same league as healthcare and some other industries. Like the responsibility is huge, and I really hope that we're going to see more and more of the legal tech development going into verifying because there is a big gap there. We're all creating things that are giving us answers, but we're not putting a lot of emphasis into verifying that. And as you said, all the boring part around creating policies, governance, best practices, training people. I really hope that we're gonna be focusing on that more in the future.
And I find it interesting because in the past, it's like you ask a product or a particular system to do XYZ, and it does it. But with AI, it's an interesting paradigm where we are comfortable with it to some extent not always being correct because of the benefits that it's providing. So that's a change because, before, if you had a calculator that you put in 12 plus 12 and it didn't give you the right answer, you'd throw away the calculator. But
Yeah,
to some extent, we're not seeing that with AI. But in others, we are, where, it only takes one bad use case, one
yeah,
sanction to really chill the effect of implementation, not just from the firm that's invested in it, but from the users. Because why, if you could do it without AI and not risk that liability and be more confident in the work product, would you risk it? But now there's
yeah,
an expectation within law firms that you are going to be using it because it's going to be saving you time, which I find it interesting. I think Axiom did a poll, and maybe 73% of law firms said that they were using AI to some extent,
yeah,
and
yeah.
yet 6% or something like that were passing on the savings to the clients.
That's it. That's amazing.
No, I said, so it's just going to be interesting because, like I said, when eventually the cost of using AI increases because the cost of maintaining the data and the data farms and the servers is going to increase when we have additional regulations about environmental laws. It'll be interesting to see how that affects the population as a whole in terms of access to the technology, but also in how firms are going to continue to build these into their pricing models. Because, as we've said, that AI doesn't necessarily work with the billable model, but may be very, very compatible with a particular fee agreement, fixed fee. If you complete it within this amount of time, we'll pay you above the fee that we were originally going to pay. There's a lot of creative billing solutions that, now that we have the ability to quantify that data, is going to be easier for billing departments to be more comfortable saying that for this particular kind of deal, we're not as concerned with the billable hour requirement, which then takes well, in some ways it takes the pressure off of the associates, but then a lot of law firm metrics are based on the billable hour as a
Mhm.
measure of an attorney's success or how much effort they're putting into their work. But if their work is then viewed in the efficiency that's saved, how does that
Yep.
look? Because in some ways, that's a very good thing. The client's saving money, but in others, that's a decrease in legal spend that the firm is able to generate revenue from. So being able to see that not as a hit to the bottom line, but the ability to take on more cases, to position yourself as being, ahead of the curve in use in securitizations or leverage finance, M&A transactions, whatever it may be, but building that as part of your brand, that your worth and your metrics of success aren't devoted or necessarily dependent on the time it takes you to complete a task, but how smartly you're able to identify where the efficiencies can be made, where the risks are, and how to navigate around that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also other industries that are seeing this switch towards more like value-based services, whereas I see that quite clearly with lawyers. If my lawyer tells me something, first of all, she prevents me doing something wrong, which could have direct financial applications. Most of the time it does. Second, I could be going in circles for months and coming up with a way worse solution that she can give me advice on in 2 minutes from the top of her head. So I wonder, probably she shouldn't bill me for the 6 months that she saved, but also I don't believe that she should bill me for 1 minute of her time, because she gave me an advice, but she had to be a lawyer for long years and study for long
Right.
years to be able to give me that advice. So I don't really think that the lawyers are kind of toast with, yeah,
It's all about the value that's being provided to the client and the
yeah,
client's the ability to explain that value to the client in a quantifiable way. And now that we're being, we have smarter tools to be able to analyze this data to predict fee models, how much a case is going to cost to litigate, how much a deal is going to, the due diligence portion of a deal is going to take based on the document. These are things that we've already had. So now using AI to maybe better interpret that data, better
mhm,
predict, that'll be an
yeah,
interesting use case that I'd like to see more people do.
yeah. No, oh man, that is, no, I'm not kidding. I didn't do them a lot, but that is by far the best conversation. It was the most natural. I feel like you were
Well,
like,
hopefully it
if
was,
not,
I felt like I was all over the place. So hopefully they can splice it into some understandable format.
yeah, they can, and usually we're way more harsh on ourselves than it actually is.
Yeah.
I think you did. It was great. It was great.
Well,
Your
thank
train of
you.
thought
I
is
really
very,
appreciate it.
yeah,
Thank you for my first podcast experiment
yeah,
and for
yeah.
reaching out across the LinkedIn ether.
Across the LinkedIn and across the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Jason, so much. That was incredibly valuable conversation. I'm very sure that it's gonna be valuable for our viewers as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, yeah, that would be great to have you again at some point. Yeah. Thanks again to Jason for the insider view from big law to AI risk, ethics, and applicability. Subscribe for the next episode and let me know in the comments below whether you want to see more discussions about risk and ethics in legal AI. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.